Welcome back, history enthusiasts. Today we're diving deep into one of the most grueling battles of World War I, the Battle of Verdun. Known as the longest battle of the Great War, Verdun became a symbol of French resilience and German tenacity. For 300 days, the world witnessed unimaginable suffering as both sides refused to back down. But what exactly happened in Verdun? Why was this battle so significant, and what can it teach us today? Let's break it down. To understand Verdun, let's rewind to 1914. After a series of brutal encounters, the war in the West became a stalemate, with German and Allied forces locked in trench warfare along the Western Front. By 1916, Germany wanted to shift the balance. The German High Command, led by Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn, believed that by attacking the fortress city of Verdun, they could force the French into a battle of attrition. Verdun wasn't just any city, it was a historic fortress, heavily fortified and deeply symbolic for the French. Falkenhayn's idea was simple yet devastating. Bleed the French army dry by forcing them to defend Verdun at all costs. He believed that France couldn't afford to lose Verdun, but would suffer massive casualties trying to hold it. The plan was codenamed Operation Gericht, or Operation Judgment. On February 21, 1916, the Battle of Verdun began with a massive German artillery barrage, some of the heaviest shelling in history. German guns fired over 1 million shells in the opening days, devastating the French front lines. The thunderous shelling echoed for miles, and soldiers described the ground as if it were alive, shifting and heaving from the endless explosions. French troops, often in hastily dug trenches and shell craters, faced intense bombardment and advancing German infantry. Despite the odds, French resistance held, thanks largely to the leadership of General Philippe Pétain, who was quickly put in charge of the French defense. Pétain became a symbol of French resolve at Verdun. He famously told his troops, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass, a phrase that would become synonymous with the French spirit of defiance. He implemented a strategy of rotating troops to avoid complete exhaustion and established the Voie sacrée, or Sacred Way, a critical supply route that ensured a steady flow of reinforcements and resources to Verdun. Through Petain's efforts, over 3,000 trucks moved supplies and soldiers to the front, keeping the French defense strong even as the battle grew more intense. Despite devastating losses, French troops held key positions at fortresses like Fort Douaumont, often retaken and lost again in brutal back-and-forth fighting. The Battle of Verdun saw a wide range of deadly weapons that defined trench warfare and set the tone for modern combat. Artillery played a central role, with both sides using massive guns to bombard enemy lines relentlessly. Germany opened the battle with a staggering 1 million shells fired on the French positions. This wasn't just firepower, but a psychological assault designed to weaken French morale before German infantry even advanced. The French and German forces both had heavy artillery, but each side used it in different ways. Germany relied on Krupp heavy howitzers and the infamous Big Bertha, huge long-range guns that could shatter fortifications like Fort Douaumont. Meanwhile, the French depended on the 75 mm field gun, known for its speed and accuracy, which allowed French forces to quickly fire and readjust for incoming attacks. Machine guns were another deadly component. The Germans favored the MG-08 Maxim gun, while the French used the Hotchkiss M1914. Both guns were capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, creating a deadly crossfire that mowed down soldiers attempting to advance. These weapons turned no man's land into a death trap, making even small gains costly. Flamethrowers also made a terrifying appearance at Verdun. Germany used the Flammenwerfer to flush out French soldiers from bunkers and trenches, introducing a new psychological weapon that spread fear among troops unprepared for this kind of close-range combat. Germany's strategy at Verdun, known as Operation Judgment, was devised by Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn. His plan wasn't necessarily to conquer Verdun entirely, but rather to bleed the French army dry. He targeted Verdun because it was a key French fortress with historical significance, and he believed France couldn't afford to lose it. By forcing the French to defend it at all costs, Falkenhayn hoped to drain France's manpower. To keep the pressure on, the Germans employed rolling barrages, which involved coordinating artillery fire to advance in a steady line. This technique created a wall of destruction that moved forward with the troops, making it difficult for French forces to mount a defense without heavy casualties. The French, however, were determined to hold Verdun, and under General Philippe Pétain's leadership, they developed their own defensive strategy. Pétain famously implemented the rotation system, where troops were regularly rotated in and out of the front lines. This helped avoid total exhaustion and kept morale relatively high despite the punishing conditions. A crucial element of Pétain's defense was the Voie sacrée, or sacred way. This single road was the lifeline of Verdun, continuously supplying troops, ammunition, and food to the front lines. Over 3,000 trucks moved along the sacred way, keeping French forces well supplied even as the Germans tried to cut off access. Without this critical supply line, the French defense would likely have collapsed. Trenches were the grim backdrop of the entire battle, but Verdun's landscape also featured a series of fortified strongholds. Verdun was surrounded by forts, and the battle often centered around their capture and defense. The most famous was Fort Douaumont, a massive fortress that changed hands multiple times. The Germans captured Douaumont early on, which gave them a strategic foothold. However, the fort was ill-prepared for modern artillery, and its capture didn't provide as significant an advantage as Germany had hoped. For months, French and German troops engaged in brutal close-quarter battles within the fort's corridors. Eventually, the French recaptured Douaumont, which became a symbol of French tenacity. Fort Vaux, another key position, saw a similar story. French forces held out against overwhelming odds, using everything at their disposal, including grenades, bayonets, and even hand-to-hand combat in the cramped spaces of the fort's tunnels. The defense of Fort Vaux became a rallying point for the French and a symbol of their resilience. One fascinating fact about Verdun is the use of underground tunnels and bunkers. Both sides dug extensive tunnel networks to protect against artillery, transport troops, and launch surprise attacks. These tunnels often stretched for miles and housed makeshift hospitals, storage rooms, and even living quarters. Another surprising element is how geography affected the battle. The dense woods and hills of Verdun made movement difficult, and rain often turned the trenches and no man's land into a quagmire. Soldiers were constantly dealing with mud, and many who fell in no man's land became trapped or drowned in the thick, sticky soil. Verdun quickly became a battle of attrition. Both sides suffered horrendous losses, with soldiers enduring horrific conditions in muddy, disease-ridden trenches. The terrain, already scarred by shell fire, became a wasteland, a nightmarish scene of shattered trees, muddy craters, and twisted barbed wire. Soldiers described the trenches as hell on earth, with constant bombardment, lack of food, and ever-present death. The German strategy, however, was flawed. While they inflicted enormous casualties, the French soldiers kept coming, determined to defend their homeland. Falkenhayn underestimated French resilience, and the battle turned into a grueling war of endurance. By the summer of 1916, the tide began to turn. The French launched counterattacks, pushing the Germans back and reclaiming lost ground. With Germany also facing pressure on the Eastern Front in the British-led Battle of the Somme, they could no longer afford the heavy losses at Verdun. In December 1916, the battle finally drew to a close. After 300 days of fighting, the front lines hadn't moved much, but both sides had lost over 700,000 men, either killed, wounded, or missing. The French held Verdun, but at an unimaginable human cost. Verdun remains a haunting symbol of the horrors of war. The determination of the French soldiers and the tragedy of lives lost taught the world a brutal lesson. Sometimes victory comes at too great a cost. Verdun was a battle that scarred a generation and changed the course of history. Thank you for watching our deep dive into the Battle of Verdun. If you found this video insightful, please like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments what other moments in history you'd like us to cover. See you next time.